The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer at 2:08 a.m., and nobody at Sacred Heart Hospital noticed when Margaret Walsh walked in. She pushed through the employee entrance with her badge already in hand, silver hair pulled back in the same bun she'd worn for 3 years, unremarkable as beige paint. The polyester of her scrubs whispered against itself, worn thin at the elbows where she'd leaned over beds 1,000 times, where her hands had steadied patients through their smallest terrors. The night shift swallowed her whole. That was the point. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and regret. 2 nurses sat at the laminate table, their conversation dying to a mumble as Margaret filled her cup from the pot they'd abandoned an hour ago. They didn't acknowledge her entrance. They wouldn't remember her name by morning rounds. They never did. "Thanks for the fresh pot," one of them said to the other, though Margaret had made it. She said nothing. Silence was a skill she perfected over 18 years, first in the Navy, then in 3 years of purposeful invisibility here in Denver. She settled into the corner chair with her coffee, black, no sugar, and watched the monitors reflected in the darkened break room window. The ICU was running for critical patients tonight. 2 of them wouldn't make it to Tuesday. She could read vital signs the way other people read newspapers. Her left shoulder ached. It always did around 3 a.m. The burn scar on her knuckles pulsed with a dull familiarity, the kind of pain that was almost comfortable after enough years. She rubbed the webbing between her thumb and index finger absently, a gesture so practiced it had become invisible even to herself. The coffee was terrible. She drank it anyway. At 3:12 a.m., Dr. Marcus Sterling arrived for his midnight rounds, and the energy in the hospital shifted like a school of fish sensing a predator upstream. His designer loafers clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm that announced him before his silhouette appeared in the corridor, expensive leather that cost more than Margaret made in a week, crossed with socks that probably had a thread count. He moved through Sacred Heart like he owned it, which, in his mind, he absolutely did. The hospital administration deferred to him. The residents trembled when he entered the room. The nurses, especially the younger ones, straightened their posture and found reasons to seem busy. Dr. Sterling didn't see Margaret in the break room corner. She was already part of the furniture by then, already absorbed into the background noise of the night shift. He was reviewing the file on his tablet, the glow illuminating his jaw in that way that certain men cultivated like a personal brand. 47 years old, cardiology fellowship from Johns Hopkins, publications in 3 major journals, consulting fees that ran through shell companies with names like Advanced Healthcare Solutions, LLC. His billing codes had been flagged twice for review in the last 18 months. Both times, he'd had conversations with the right people and the flags had disappeared. The admission in ICU Bay 4 was flagged differently. Premium flag. Military benefits flag. The kind that made Dr. Sterling's pupils dilate when he saw it because it meant the patient's care would be covered under TRICARE, which meant every procedure, every intervention, every test would be reimbursed at rates that allowed for a certain creative flexibility in documentation. The patient's name was David Chen. Sergeant Major, United States Marine Corps. No next of kin listed. Admitted 2 hours ago with acute respiratory distress, oxygen saturation dropping despite high-flow nasal cannula. Dr. Sterling's mind was already calculating. A sergeant major with comprehensive military benefits coverage could support 3 months of consulting fees if the case went the right direction. A few cardiac interventions. Maybe a pulmonary catheterization. The margins were exquisite. Margaret refilled her coffee at 3:31 a.m., and that was when the intercom crackled, Code Blue, ICU Bay 4. Code Blue, ICU Bay 4. She didn't run. She walked. Controlled. Purposeful. The kind of walk that came from having already been through worse, much worse, the kind of walk that didn't waste energy on panic. Her badge was already moving toward the ICU entrance when she heard the charge cart wheeling past her, heard the code team assembling like a well-oiled machine, heard the shallow, desperate breathing of a patient whose lungs were betraying him. ICU Bay 4 was chaos in the way that only hospital chaos could be, organized, professional, absolutely terrifying. Sergeant Major David Chen lay on the bed in a hospital gown the color of old dishwater, his lips already taking on that faint blue tint, his chest heaving like a man drowning in air. The respiratory therapist was already there, already bagging him with an ambu device, but the O2 sat was refusing to climb. 68, 66, 71, the numbers were dancing in the wrong direction. Margaret moved to the bedside without being asked. She'd been a nurse in 3 years here, but her hands had done this work for much longer than that, in hospitals with sand on the floors and the sound of incoming mortars in the distance. Her fingers found the for access, checked for infiltration. The line was clean. She was already reaching for the nitroglycerin drip, already calculating volumes and flow rates, when she felt the presence of authority enter the room. Dr. Sterling pushed through the cluster of residents with the momentum of a man accustomed to parting crowds. His loafers clicked. His white coat flared. Behind him came his entourage, 2 junior residents and a medical student who looked like he hadn't slept since orientation. They expected him to take command. They expected chaos to resolve into order because Dr. Sterling had arrived. Instead, they found Margaret Walsh standing at the head of the bed, her hands moving through the work with the precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before, or maybe 10,000 times in circumstances far more dire. She wasn't performing. She wasn't grandstanding. She was simply there, steady as ballast, and the monitors were already responding to her presence. "What's the story?" Dr. Sterling's voice cracked like authority, the tone of a man used to being answered immediately. "Acute decompensation," Margaret said without looking up. "Respiratory distress progressing. O2 sat refused to climb above 72 on high-flow nasal cannula. I started supplemental support." She adjusted the drip with a single, economical gesture. Already her presence had altered the room's physics. Already the patient's chest was rising more easily, the panic draining from his face like water through cupped hands. Dr. Sterling took the tablet from the senior resident, scanning the history with the flick of a practiced eye. 62-year-old male. 40 years of smoking. Copped exacerbation, probably. Straightforward. Billable. He was already mentally drafting the consult notes when he looked directly at the patient's face for the first time. Sergeant Major David Chen's eyes were open. Clear. Lucid. And they were locked on Margaret's face with an intensity that had nothing to do with oxygen deprivation. "This nurse will do fine," Chen said, his voice still thin but steady, his breath finding its rhythm again under her care. "I want her. She stays." Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. It was a small thing, barely visible, but Margaret saw it. She'd spent enough years reading men in positions of power to know that tightness meant calculation. Meant reassessment. Meant the beginning of something. "Of course," Dr. Sterling said smoothly, already turning toward the residents. "Monitor his vitals closely. Call me if anything changes." He was already moving toward the door, already establishing distance, and Margaret understood with the clarity of long experience that something had just shifted in the hospital's politics. Something had just become dangerous. Behind her, Sergeant Major Chen's oxygen saturation climbed to 89. Then 91. Then 94, where it plateaued in the green zone like a prayer answered. His breathing eased. His color improved. His hands, which had been gripping the bed rails with the panic of a drowning man, relaxed against the sheets. The code team dispersed. The crisis had resolved. The night shift returned to its quiet rotation, and Margaret stayed at the bedside for another 3 minutes, documenting vitals, checking the foresight, ensuring the drip was running at precisely the correct rate. She still hadn't looked directly at Chen, hadn't acknowledged the intensity of his attention, hadn't broken her professional composure. But something in the way he watched her, something in the recognition that passed between them like a frequency only they could hear, told her that this patient was different. That whatever had brought Sergeant Major David Chen to Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver at 2 a.m. with respiratory distress wasn't just medical history. It was history. At 4:33 a.m., with Chen stable and sleeping, Margaret stood in the supply closet for exactly 90 seconds. Her locker door was open. The pair of worn combat boots sat at the bottom, their desert tan faded to the color of old bone, their laces still knotted from the last time she'd worn them, 18 years ago, in a burning schoolhouse in Tikrit, carrying a child who weighed almost nothing in her arms. The soles were cracked. The heels were worn through on one side. They smelled like dust and memory and a life she'd promised herself she'd left behind. She reached out, touched the rough leather with her scarred hands, then closed the locker door without taking them out. The night shift had 4 more hours to run. The morning shift arrived at 6:56 a.m., fluorescent light spilling across ICU bay for where Sergeant Major David Chen lay propped at 30 degrees, his breathing shallow and deliberate. Dr. Sterling pushed through the double doors with his usual entourage, 2 residents trailing like satellites, and stopped mid-stride when he saw her. Margaret stood beside Chen's bed with one hand adjusting the oxygen flow, her weathered fingers moving the dial with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, not protocol. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge Sterling's presence. Her silver hair caught the harsh hospital light, and her scrubs, the same faded blue she'd worn for 3 years, hung loose on a frame that seemed to occupy less space than it should. "This nurse will do fine," Chen said quietly. His eyes locked on Margaret's face with an intensity that made Sterling's calculating mind snap to attention. "I don't need the head of medicine. I need her." Sterling felt something trip inside his chest. Not concern. Recognition. The kind of recognition that happened when a golden ticket suddenly developed complications. He'd reviewed Chen's intake paperwork at 5 a.m., already mapping the billing architecture. Marine Sergeant Major. Comprehensive military benefits. The kind of coverage that justified his consulting fee structure, the shell companies, the inflated surgical interventions, the diagnostic procedures that insurance audits never questioned because military healthcare existed in its own bureaucratic universe. One case like this could net $40,000 in consulting arrangements over 6 months. But a patient with specific requests. A patient who looked at a nurse like she was someone he'd known in another life entirely. Sterling's jaw tightened. "I'll make a note that Nurse Walsh is available for your care, Sergeant Major. Our team approach ensures." "Not your team, Doctor," Chen said, voice steady as a rifle shot. Sterling left without responding, already thinking 3 moves ahead. He'd orchestrated staff rotations before. He'd reassigned nurses with far less justification. But this felt different. This felt like the kind of attention he couldn't afford. Chen's adult daughter and son-in-law arrived during 7 a.m. rounds, positioning themselves on either side of the hospital bed. Margaret had already taken vitals, blood pressure 138/82, oxygen saturation 94% on 4 liters, heart rate holding at 86. The numbers were stable. The patient was calm. Everything about the situation was textbook until Sterling entered with his residents in tow, chart in hand, his expression arranged into professional concern. "Nurse Walsh, this documentation is incomplete and frankly sloppy," he said, not looking at Margaret, addressing Chen's family instead. The tone was a scalpel, sharp enough to cut, subtle enough to seem innocent. "Did you even read the protocol manual, or are we operating on memory from whatever diploma mill trained you?" Margaret took one measured breath. Chen started to speak, but Sterling continued, his voice dropping half an octave. "I understand night shift can be confusing for someone your age, but this is ICU, not a nursing home. Our patients deserve better than forgetfulness." Chen's daughter stared at the floor. Her husband's jaw clenched. Margaret stood motionless for 2 full seconds, then looked up and met Sterling's eyes with the kind of stillness that made his residents unconsciously step backward. "The documentation follows the exact protocol you posted last month, Doctor," she said quietly. "I memorized it." One tear escaped without warning, sliding down her cheek in a single clean line. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without giving him the satisfaction of watching her crumble. The vital signs are documented at 30-minute intervals. Oxygen adjustments logged with timestamps. Medication administration recorded before each dose. Everything in the manual. Sterling's jaw tightened. He'd expected deflection or apology or the defensive anger that made people easy to dismiss. Not this. Not the calm, factual recitation of a nurse who'd apparently absorbed his posted protocols with the same precision he'd absorbed 3 years of medical school. Not the single tear that somehow made her look stronger, not weaker. He turned and left without another word, already calculating how to move forward. At 3 a.m., Margaret sat in the hospital break room with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in plastic. The microwave hummed its mechanical idle. Fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular hospital pallor that turned living skin the color of something already preserved. 4 nurses sat clustered around a table near the window, Jessica from nights, 2 float nurses, and Marcus from the weekend rotation. They were laughing about something, voices bright and loose the way voices got after midnight when the hospital belonged to skeleton crews and sleeping patients. The moment Margaret pulled back a chair and sat down, the laughter stopped. She watched them with the kind of patience that came from 12 duty stations and 1,000 moments exactly like this. One of the float nurses checked her phone. Jessica suddenly remembered she needed to log something in the computer system. Marcus decided his shift break had ended 5 minutes ago. Within 90 seconds, the table was empty except for Margaret and a spreading puddle of silence that tasted like copper and burnt coffee grounds. She'd seen Sterling talking to them during the evening briefing. She'd watched his lips move, seen the concerned expression he cultivated like an expensive suit, the one that said he was worried, not angry, just deeply concerned about professional boundaries and patient safety and whether certain staff members had the emotional stability for critical care. She'd heard him say things like past trauma responses and possible PTSD manifestations and liability exposure. Margaret opened her thermos. The coffee smelled like diesel exhaust and old blankets, the way it always did when she made it at home in the pre-dawn darkness. She drank it slowly, not tasting it, just letting the ritual move through her the way it had for years, inhale, sip, swallow, breathe. The sandwich remained wrapped. Her hands remained steady. At 7:03 a.m., Sterling posted the disciplinary notice on the unit board outside ICU, positioned precisely where every staff member passed during shift change. The header was formatted in bold Arial, failure to maintain professional boundaries. Margaret's name underneath in all caps like a conviction. The text read, Nurse M. Walsh has demonstrated inappropriate familiarity with patient D. Chen, including extended non-clinical conversations and care beyond assigned duties. This behavior creates liability exposure and violates professional standards outlined in Unit Protocol for Point 7.2. 20 staff members read it during the 7 a.m. rotation. The board filled up with the usual notices, reminders about hand hygiene compliance, announcements about upcoming trainings, a notice about the cafeteria changing its coffee supplier. But Margaret's disciplinary posting stood out because it was the only one with a person's full name attached to a professional failure. Margaret read it while holding her coffee, her eyes moving across the text with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything else. Her hand didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing remained steady and measured. She was a woman reading a piece of paper, and the paper was just paper, and she was just reading it, and that was all anyone could see. Sterling watched from the nurse's station 30 feet away, his posture relaxed, his expression composed. He waited exactly 4 minutes, long enough for her to absorb the notice, not so long that it seemed deliberately orchestrated, then walked toward her with the kind of casual precision that made his movements feel inevitable. You're too old and confused for critical care, Walsh, he said quietly, only for her, his voice the color of regret. Maybe it's time to consider retirement. There's no shame in stepping back. Plenty of nurses transition to admin roles or floor nursing where the pace is slower. Margaret turned to face him. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, and something shifted in them, not anger, not fear, something deeper and colder and far more dangerous. She took one measured breath, and in that breath was the sound of a machine gun and the smell of burning diesel and the weight of bodies and the knowledge of exactly how much damage a human being could survive. A single tear escaped which she wiped away without flinching, her movements precise as a field medic's, her voice when she spoke carrying a weight that made Sterling's blood pressure spike. Sergeant Major Chen and I understand each other perfectly, "Doctor," she said. "He was 8 years old in Tikrit when I carried him out of a burning school." The hallway went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence where you could hear the ventilator 3 rooms down and the fluorescent lights humming their electric requiem and Sterling's breath catching in his throat like he'd swallowed something too large. His mind raced. 8 years old. Tikrit. 2004. That placed her in Iraq during the Sunni insurgency surge, the period when marine casualties spiked and medevac missions became desperate probability equations about who you could save and who you'd have to leave. That placed her somewhere in the chaos with Chen, 2 decades ago, connected by something that went far deeper than a professional nurse-patient relationship. His jaw tightened as the implications registered like incoming mortars. This wasn't a confused night shift nurse. This was something else entirely, something that came with a history and a connection that audit trails couldn't unwind, something that put his entire billing apparatus at risk if anyone started asking questions about why a sergeant major specifically requested a nurse who'd been in theater with him. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Patricia Hendricks, board member, lunch confirmed. Discussing expanded consulting arrangements. Sterling walked away without acknowledging Margaret's statement, already recalculating, already moving to his next move. He needed her rotated off this case. He needed it done carefully, methodically, in a way that looked inevitable rather than orchestrated. He needed Chen reassigned to a different care team before the sergeant major's military benefits triggered the kind of attention that people in Sterling's position couldn't afford. That evening, Margaret sat in her 2008 Honda Civic in the parking garage, forehead pressed against the steering wheel while her breath fogged the windshield. Inside the hospital, Sterling made 3 phone calls from his private office. First to Patricia Hendricks, "I'm concerned about a nurse with undisclosed military background. Possible PTSD manifestations. Patient specifically requesting her care in a way that's emotionally unhealthy. Could be liability." Second to HR Director Alan Moss, "Pattern of boundary violations with veteran patients. Nurse Walsh seems to identify with them in ways that go beyond professional. Wondering if we need to assess her fitness for critical care." Third to Richard Torres, an outside healthcare compliance investigator, "Need objective review of a problematic employee. Potential policy violations. Prefer documentation that shows we took patient safety seriously." Each conversation planted seeds carefully, never direct accusations, just concerned questions about patient safety and liability exposure, the kind of soft language that made paranoia sound like professionalism. Margaret drove home to the small ranch house she shared with her teenage daughter Emma, arriving at 11 p.m. to find Emma studying for chemistry at the kitchen table, periodic tables and molecular diagrams spread across the laminate surface. The house smelled like Emma's student stress and Margaret's absence, coffee that had gone cold hours ago, a microwave dinner in the trash. "How was work, Mom?" Emma asked without looking up. Margaret managed fine, honey, and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. She opened the closet and stared at the shadow box she'd kept hidden for 3 years, hanging on a hook behind winter coats nobody wore anymore in Denver. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart. A photograph of a younger woman in dress blues, not quite Margaret's face, or exactly Margaret's face, but the version of Margaret from another lifetime, the one who existed before she learned that saving lives and keeping secrets were the same skill. She closed the closet quickly, the way she always did, like closing it fast could prevent the nightmares from building behind her eyes. But they were building anyway. They always were. At Sacred Heart Hospital, Sergeant Major Chen's oxygen saturation began dropping at midnight despite maximum flow. The monitor registered first 96%. Then 94%. Then 91%. His lungs weren't accepting oxygen anymore because something inside his chest was collapsing, pressure building against his lung tissue, a tension pneumothorax developing exactly as invisible and inevitable as a storm moving across the plains. In 6 hours, his condition would become critical. In 8 hours, without intervention, his heart would stop. Nobody knew it yet. The monitor beeped its regular rhythm while Chen slept, and Margaret was gone, and Sterling was already asleep in his 4,000-square-foot house, dreaming of consulting fees and clean audits and nurses who disappeared quietly when they became inconvenient. But the clock was running now. The pressure was building. And Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh was about to discover that retirement wasn't an option when the person you'd saved 20 years ago was dying on a hospital bed 3 miles away, and the only person standing between him and Code Blue was a nurse nobody remembered and a doctor who'd already decided she needed to disappear. Margaret stands motionless in front of Sterling, her supervisor already turning away down the corridor. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, a mechanical sound like a heartbeat skipping. Sterling's words hang in the air like contaminated air that needs clearing. 3 years. 3 years of being forgettable, of sliding through shifts like smoke, and now this moment, this one terrible moment where the person who taught her how to breathe again under fire is deteriorating 3 floors above and she's been reassigned to post-surgical recovery. She takes one measured breath. Not the breath of someone about to break. The breath of someone who has already made a choice. A single tear escapes. Just one. She wipes it away without flinching, her weathered hand moving with the same precision that once steadied the hands of 12 children in a burning schoolhouse in Tikrit. The tear is not weakness. It is the only thing she permits herself, 1 tear for the weight of 3 years of pretending, 1 tear for the boy who became a sergeant major, 1 tear for the impossible mathematics of being close enough to save someone and far enough away that the system would let them die. Sterling watches her. His jaw tightens slightly, waiting for the breakdown he orchestrated, waiting for the moment when this invisible nurse finally snaps and gives him the justification he needs. He is a man accustomed to women trembling at his dismissal. He is not accustomed to women who have already survived the unsurvivable. Margaret's voice comes out quiet. Not broken. Not apologetic. Steady like a surgeon's hand holding a scalpel in a field hospital under fire. Sergeant Major Chen and I understand each other perfectly, Doctor. He was 8 years old in Tikrit when I carried him out of a burning school. The silence doesn't come slowly. It arrives all at once, complete, the way silence arrives in the 3 seconds before an IED detonates. The kind of silence where you can hear the hum of the patient monitors 17 floors below, where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, where you can hear the specific sound of a man's entire calculated world shifting on its axis. Sterling's jaw tightens. Not a flinch, not yet. Just the physical recognition that the equation he solved so carefully, premium military benefits, billing codes he'd been running for 2 years through shell consulting companies, the predictable trajectory of a high-value patient nobody would question, has just become unsolvable. His eyes search her face like he's looking for something he missed. The silver hair pulled back in a bun. The calloused hands. The wrinkles around her eyes that come from 18 years of watching people bleed out on operating tables in desert tents. The kind of eyes that have seen everything and flinch at nothing. This is not a night nurse he hired 3 years ago. This is something else entirely, and the wrongness of it, the absolute magnitude of his miscalculation, spreads through his chest like an infection. She doesn't look away. She doesn't apologize. She doesn't explain or defend or offer excuses for knowing a sergeant major whose medical records carry military designations that trigger specific insurance coverage protocols. She simply stands there, a grandmother in scrubs, and tells him the truth in 10 words. His mind races. Not anger yet. First comes the mathematics. If Margaret Walsh carried David Chen from Tikrit, if they have that kind of connection, that kind of history, then Chen asking specifically for her care isn't coincidence. It's precision. It's a man who remembers who held him when the walls collapsed, who remember which hands were steady when everything else was burning. Which means Chen trusts her. Which means if Margaret is on his case, if she's the one managing his care, she sees everything. Charts. Treatments. Billing codes. The decisions Sterling made about his care that prioritize extended stays and diagnostic procedures over actual intervention. A senior chief petty officer from a classified operation in Iraq 20 years ago, now working night shifts at Sacred Heart, now assigned to the patient she saved. That combination of details, once known, triggers investigations. Military personnel with decorated records don't just appear in civilian hospitals by accident. There are background checks. There are questions. There is oversight. Sterling's jaw clenches tighter. The golden ticket patient has already been connected to a decorated military officer, and if anyone, if any investigator, any auditor, any administrator with even basic curiosity starts asking questions about why a senior chief petty officer is working as a night nurse, they will eventually ask about the medical decisions being made on her watch. They will ask about billing patterns. They will ask about the consistency of his orders across multiple patients. The silence stretches. No one moves. Sterling's breathing becomes controlled, the breathing of a man who is already calculating damage control, already thinking about calls he'll make, about how quickly he can reassign Margaret, how thoroughly he can discredit her, how definitively he can separate her from Chen's case before the connection deepens. But something in Margaret's stillness, the way she stands without flinching, without apology, without the slightest tremor of fear, tells him something else. This woman has already survived worse than his career can inflict. She has already faced down circumstances that required courage measured in lives saved, not promotions earned. The power dynamic he relied on, hospital hierarchy, institutional authority, his position as attending physician, suddenly feels like the architecture of someone very fragile trying to intimidate someone made of something harder than concrete. He steps back. Just one step, but it's a step backward. You're done with this patient, Margaret. Effective immediately. I'm filing this conversation with administration. She doesn't respond. She simply nods, a motion so small it's barely visible, and turns to walk back toward post-surgical recovery. Her pace is even. Measured. The pace of someone who has already made peace with losing everything because she understood long ago that the only thing that mattered was the people you carried out of burning buildings, not the uniforms you wore afterward or the hospitals that would eventually forget your name. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that would actually cost Sterling everything. Because at 4:56 a.m., while Margaret is starting in 4 on a post-surgical hip replacement in Recovery Room 2, Sergeant Major David Chen's oxygen saturation begins dropping. Not slowly. Not gradually. The telemetry monitor shows the cliff of it, 88%, 85%, 82%, and the pressure inside his chest cavity is building like a kettle with the lid sealed, and the young on-call resident, Dr. Amy Choi, is staring at the monitor like it might offer her instruction she hasn't received in the 3 weeks since she graduated. Sterling is in his office. His phone shows a text to Margaret's supervisor already sent, already delivered, reassign Walsh from ICU bay for effective immediately, compliance review pending. The message is 6 minutes old. The message is already working. The message is already separating Margaret from the patient she knows well enough to read without looking at vital signs, the patient whose breathing pattern she can distinguish from other patients on the unit because she has been listening to people breathe for 38 years. And in post-surgical recovery, Margaret is cleaning her hands with a precision that mirrors the old Navy protocols, when soap and water and the methodical counting of seconds was the only sterilization available, and she catches the alert on the monitor board, Chen's room, ICU Bay 4, oxygen sat dropping, and nobody noticing, and Sterling unreachable, and the resident still staring at monitors like they're written in a language she's still learning. Margaret's supervisor appears at the recovery room door. Finish with your current patient. You're not assigned to Bay 4 anymore. Margaret doesn't argue. Not yet. But her hands stop moving over the hip replacement's 4 line, and something ancient, something that predates her retirement by decades, wakes up in the back of her mind. The same thing that woke up in Tikrit when she heard the first screams from the school. The same thing that kept her moving when the heat was so intense it felt like the air itself was burning. She doesn't know yet what she's going to do. She only knows that someone is drowning in a hospital bed 3 floors above, and the system designed to save him is broken, and the only person who understands the particular way David Chen's lungs respond to pressure is being deliberately separated from his care. She finishes the 4. Documents it. Sets the hip replacement patient's call light where they can reach it. And then she walks toward the stairwell, not the elevators, because elevators can be tracked and elevators show destination floors and elevators are the path people expect. The stairwell is how you move when you're not supposed to be somewhere. The stairwell is how you do things that violate protocol. Behind her, Sterling is still in his office, still believing that he has separated Margaret from Chen, still believing that the threat has been managed. But what he doesn't understand, what he cannot possibly understand, is that you don't spend 38 years in medicine, 12 of those years in active combat zones, without learning that the system can be worked from the inside when nobody is watching, that protocols exist for people who follow rules, and that some people were trained long before there were rules to follow, back when the only rule was, somebody is dying and you move. The monitor shows 78% and dropping. The resident's voice cracks slightly as she reaches for the crash cart. And in the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time in soft shoes that don't make a sound, Margaret's breathing stays absolutely even, absolutely steady, the breathing of someone who stopped being afraid of consequences the moment she realized that not moving would kill someone, and moving couldn't make that outcome any worse. The intercom crackled at 4:07 a.m. Code blue, ICU Bay 4. Margaret was already moving, her feet finding the stairs before her conscious mind caught the words, muscle memory older than her civilian life pulling her toward the sound of alarms. Chen's chest had stopped moving on the right side. The asymmetry was visible even from the doorway, his right lung collapsed inward while the left side heaved in desperate compensation, his neck veins bulging like rope beneath skin, his lips the color of storm clouds. 89 kilograms of marine laid out on starched sheets with his body shutting down in layers, oxygen saturation plummeting from 94 to 88 to 72, the monitor screaming in high-pitched urgency that nobody seemed to hear. Dr. Amy Choi stood frozen beside the crash cart, her hand shaking so badly she couldn't hold the needle. Her voice came out thin, fractured, nothing like the controlled clinician who'd passed boards 3 months ago. I need to, someone call Sterling, I need, her fingers fumbled at the instrument tray and dropped a 14-gauge angiocath, the plastic clicking against tile. She tried again. Dropped it again. Her breathing synchronized with the monitor's scream, panic feeding panic, hands locked in the tremor of someone watching a patient die on her shift. Oxygen saturation at 61. The monitor's rhythm became a series of sharp staccato demands. Chen's eyes were still open, still conscious, still aware of the fact that he was suffocating in a bed surrounded by machines that were supposed to prevent exactly this. His hand moved toward his chest in that primal gesture, the body's protest against its own collapse. Margaret stepped into the room without asking permission, without apology, without the hesitation that had defined her 3 years at Sacred Heart. She didn't speak. Her left hand found his ribs, counting down from the clavicle with the certainty of someone who'd done this in the dark, in the rain, in the roar of incoming mortars. 1 rib. 2 ribs. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Her right hand held the needle steady as her body remembered what her mouth had never spoken aloud, the weight of 12 children carried out of a burning school, the pressure of shrapnel in her abdomen that still ached when the weather turned, the sound of gunfire that had never quite left her sleep. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space was audible across the room, pressure release so sudden that Chen's chest wall decompressed almost violently, his lungs finally able to expand against the collapsed pressure of his own trapped air. Oxygen saturation climbed. 72 to 78 to 85 to 94 in 30 seconds of aerodynamic grace, the kind of physiologic recovery that shouldn't have felt so personal, but did. His eyes found hers and his voice came out like gravel through a whisper, "Still got it, Chief." Dr. Choi collapsed against the wall, her entire body folding in on itself, tears streaming down her face as she gasped for breath like she'd been the one suffocating. Relief that broke something open in her chest, gratitude that made her shoulders shake, the knowledge that she'd just watched a patient die in her hands and been saved by a nurse who wasn't supposed to be there. Margaret adjusted the oxygen flow with the same calm she'd used in the field hospital at FOB Shank, the same rhythm she'd maintained when mortars fell outside the tent and the dust settled on bandages and the screaming never got quieter no matter how many casualties you treated. She documented the procedure in the chart: 14-gauge needle decompression, second intercostal space midclavicular line, immediate symptom relief, vital sign stabilized. Her handwriting was precise, unshaking, the notation of a professional recording data rather than a woman who'd just performed a surgical procedure she wasn't credentialed to perform, in a hospital where protocols existed for reasons, even when those reasons moved slower than a patient's collapsing lung. Dr. Sterling arrived 7 minutes later. He stood in the doorway of ICU Bay for exactly 3 seconds, his eyes moving from Chen to Margaret to the crash cart to the needle on the instrument tray, assessing the scene with the clinical detachment of someone whose mind was already calculating exit strategies. He didn't ask what happened. He'd pieced it together in that first glance, the nurse, the procedure, the violation, the liability exposure spreading through his careful architecture like water through drywall. He turned and left without a word. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened in the next 3 hours was Dr. Sterling activating a network he'd spent 2 years cultivating, calling in favors from board members who'd benefited from his inflated consulting fees, leverage that came in the form of influence and fear. The first call went to board member James Hendricks at 4:23 a.m., Sterling's voice carrying the urgent professionalism of a doctor protecting his institution. Rogue nurse, performed emergency procedure way beyond scope of practice. We're talking massive liability exposure here. The second call went to hospital administrator David Chen at 4:31 a.m., a different David Chen who'd never even met Sergeant Major Chen, listening as Sterling's words painted a picture of a nurse operating without authorization, creating legal jeopardy, necessitating immediate separation. The third call went to an outside investigator named Torres at 4:33 a.m., Sterling's tone shifting to fatherly concern about patterns of insubordination, about a nurse who repeatedly crossed boundaries, about documented evidence he would of course provide to accelerate the review process. The fourth call was to hospital legal counsel at 5:15 a.m., Sterling speaking with the efficiency of a man who'd done this calculus before, framing the narrative as institutional protection rather than professional retaliation. Separate immediately, full documentation of performance concerns, have termination paperwork prepared by end of business. By 2 p.m., Margaret was being escorted out by a security guard named Thomas, a man who'd held the elevator for her 1,000 times, who'd helped her carry equipment, who now looked at his shoes rather than her face. Her belongings were in a cardboard box, a change of scrubs, a photograph of Emma, a half-empty packet of gum, a dog-eared notebook with shift notes. At the top of the box, visible and accusatory, were a pair of combat boots. Old boots. Worn boots. Boots with scuffed leather and sand ground into the seams that she'd carried from her locker every single day for 3 years, unable to throw them away because throwing them away felt like a betrayal, like admitting that the person who'd worn them in the sand had died somewhere between Baghdad and the night shift at Sacred Heart. She walked past the nurses' station where every colleague suddenly became intensely interested in their computer screens, in their charts, in literally anything that required sustained eye contact avoidance. Chen saw her through the glass of ICU Bay 4, still hooked to portable oxygen, and tried to sit up despite the tube in his chest, despite the catheter in his arm, despite orders to remain supine. Margaret shook her head once, the kind of command that transcended rank, that came from the bone-deep authority of someone who'd kept him alive when he was 8 years old and smoke was filling his lungs instead of air. He understood. He lay back down. Dr. Sterling watched from his office on the 3rd floor, already composing the email to Chen's incoming care team about the regrettable personnel matter, assuring them that continuity of care remained paramount, that the incident in no way reflected on Sacred Heart's commitment to excellence. The email would arrive within the hour, preemptive framing, narrative control before anyone could ask questions about why the best nurse on the unit had suddenly been terminated. That evening, at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday when the sun was still high and the world still functioning normally, Margaret sat at her kitchen table in the house where she'd raised a daughter alone, where she'd hidden 20 years of military service behind a night shift and a simple bun in her hair, where she'd never once brought the war home because bringing the war home would mean admitting it had happened. The termination letter was spread in front of her. Performance concerns. Insubordination. Breach of scope of practice. Effective immediately. Emma came home early from school, her phone had buzzed with a calendar reminder and something in her 16-year-old intuition told her that today was different, that her mother needed something that wasn't being provided by the adult world. She found Margaret at the kitchen table at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, still in her scrubs, tears running down her face in a way Emma had never witnessed, in a way that broke something in the daughter's understanding of who her mother was. Margaret looked like she was breaking, like the careful structure of her quiet life had collapsed the same way Chen's lung had collapsed, suddenly and completely and with no warning. "Mom? Why are you home? What happened?" Margaret couldn't speak. The words stuck in her throat like she'd never learned language, like she'd only ever known how to be quiet, how to move through the world without disturbing it. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, Emma realized, but from something worse. From restraint. From the effort of not breaking something. "Sometimes good people lose, honey." Her voice cracked on the word lose, on the implication that she'd been good at something and failed anyway, that effort and competence and doing the right thing sometimes wasn't enough. Emma had never seen her mother broken. She'd only known the woman who worked night shifts and came home with that calm expression, who listened without judgment and spoke in measured tones, who never raised her voice or showed weakness or admitted that the world had ever been anything other than manageable. Looking at her mother crying at the kitchen table, Emma realized she didn't actually know who this woman was, what she'd done before nursing, what experiences had carved that quiet strength into her bones. "Mom, what did you do?" Emma asked, suddenly aware of how little she knew. "Before nursing, what did you do?" Margaret just shook her head, unable to form words, unable to explain that she'd been someone else once, that there was a version of her that existed in a photograph in a dusty box in the attic, a younger version wearing a uniform and standing in front of people who believed she could save them. That version felt like a ghost. That version felt like a lie. She put her head down on the table and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry since 2004, since the day she realized that saving a child couldn't save you from what you'd seen. By morning, Margaret's shift had ended like all the others, except this time security was waiting at her locker. The guard, Michaels, who'd nodded to her every Tuesday for 3 years, wouldn't meet her eyes as he handed her the cardboard box. Her belongings were inside. The stethoscope she'd carried since 2006. The trauma shears with her initials worn smooth from 1,000 emergency cuts. And at the bottom, visible enough that anyone passing would see them, the pair of worn combat boots she'd kept in the locker's dark corner, the leather creased and scarred from desert sand that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. She held the box without speaking. Michael shifted his weight. "Dr. Sterling signed off on it this morning. Said you're a liability." Margaret didn't ask what she'd done wrong. She already knew. She set the box down, changed out of her scrubs into the clothes she'd worn to the hospital at 10 p.m. the night before, and walked out into Denver's morning light like someone moving through water, the cardboard box heavy against her ribs. She was home by 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, still in yesterday's clothes, still smelling like antiseptic and failure. Her daughter Emma found her at the kitchen table, the box open beside her, the boots sitting on the linoleum like artifacts from another life. "Mom." Emma's voice came from the doorway, confused. She wasn't supposed to be home at this hour. Nobody was supposed to be home. What happened? Margaret couldn't answer. The words were there but they wouldn't move. She opened her mouth twice, closed it, and finally something came out, fractured and quiet. "Sometimes good people lose, honey." Her voice broke on the last word. Emma crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders, and Margaret let her daughter hold her because she didn't have the strength to hold herself anymore, and that was when she understood what Dr. Sterling had done, not just taken her job, but taken the one thing she'd protected for 18 years, the ability to pretend she was just a nurse, unremarkable and unknown, saved from her own history by the mercy of invisibility. Emma didn't sleep that night. By 6 a.m., she was in the hospital's administrative wing, holding the shadow box she'd found in the attic while her mother slept on the couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The board meeting was already in progress when Emma pushed open the conference room door. Dr. Sterling was mid-sentence, something about professional protocols and patterns of insubordination, when her voice cut through the room. "My mom didn't want anyone to know." Emma's hands trembled as she set the frame on the mahogany table. "But you need to see these." The room went still in the way that only happens when the world shifts between before and after. The Navy Cross caught the fluorescent overhead lights, its ribbon a cascade of red and white against the glass. 2 silver stars flanked it like sentries. The Purple Heart lay at the bottom of the frame, and beside all of them, a photograph, a younger Margaret in dress blues, her hair pulled back in the same simple bun but her posture different, shoulders back, eyes forward, the weight of command visible in the set of her jaw. No one spoke. Board Chair Henderson, who'd been a SEAL commander himself before taking the hospital position, leaned forward until the photograph filled his vision. The photograph showed a woman he didn't recognize, which meant he was looking at the woman Margaret had stopped being the day she walked into Sacred Heart Hospital. Sergeant Major Chen stood from his wheelchair slowly, deliberately, his legs still weak from the pneumothorax but his bearing steel straight. He moved to the table with the careful precision of someone whose body remembered the cost of movement. When he spoke, his voice didn't sound like a patient's voice. It sounded like command. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, United States Navy. The formality in his tone transformed the room. These weren't just medals. This was recognition. This was witness. A nurse pulled Chen's military medical file, her hands shaking as she read aloud. Tikrit, 2004. Jolin District School. 12 children recovered from an active insurgent compound. Field triage performed under fire by Navy corpsmen, the nurse's voice caught. She swallowed. By Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Multiple life-threatening injuries treated with. She stopped, looked at the file again. With her hands and whatever field supplies were available. No anesthesia. No backup. Just her. The silence after those words was the kind that comes when the full weight of sacrifice becomes visible. Henderson stood. He moved to the frame and lifted it carefully, as though the glass might break if he breathed too hard. He turned to face the room, and when he spoke, each word was its own statement, Navy Cross. He paused. For extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. Another pause. 2 silver stars for valor in combat operations. His voice dropped an octave. And a Purple Heart for wounds received while saving others. He set the frame back on the table like he was placing a monument. The board members stared at the photograph. They were seeing 2 different women now, the invisible nurse they'd never quite noticed, and the warrior whose hands had held a child's life together in desert sand. The next voice came from the back of the room. An FBI agent stood, her credentials open in her left hand. She'd been auditing Sacred Heart's billing practices for 3 months. Dr. Sterling's insurance fraud scheme is fully documented, she said, her tone carrying the weight of federal authority. 3 shell consulting companies. Inflated billing codes. We have financial records, email chains, and payment transfers totaling approximately $847,000 over 24 months. She stepped forward. Senior Chief Walsh's presence on Sergeant Major Chen's case triggered the final review that broke the entire operation open. Her direct involvement in his care created a chain of evidence that led us to the consulting contracts and the billing fraud structure. She turned to Sterling. You're under federal investigation, Dr. Sterling. Your practice privileges are suspended, effective immediately. The same security guard who'd handed Margaret the cardboard box the day before walked to where Dr. Sterling sat frozen at the conference table. Michaels held out another box, this one smaller, containing Sterling's personal effects. His voice was flat, drained of any courtesy. I believe you know the way out, sir. Sterling's face had drained to a color that matched the walls. He stood without speaking, without looking at anyone, and walked to the door like a man moving through a dream where nothing connected anymore, not his feet to the floor, not his hands to his arms, not his carefully constructed world to anything that resembled reality. The door closed behind him. Henderson turned to Margaret, who stood in the doorway with Emma, still wearing yesterday's clothes. We need to talk about your future here, Senior Chief. Margaret took a job in Sacred Heart's new Veteran Services Department, part-time, daylight hours only. The night shifts had become unbearable, every monitor alarm sounding like incoming mortars, every overhead page like radio static from Tikrit, the fluorescent lights creating shadows that moved wrong. The daytime position came with a window that faced the mountains, and light that came from the sun instead of burning overhead. The hospital offered her full back pay, a formal apology, and reinstatement to her previous position, but she declined. Some doors, once closed by trauma, shouldn't be reopened in darkness. Instead, she consulted with veterans struggling to translate their service into civilian healthcare systems, helping them navigate the maze of benefits and adjustments that nobody explained when you left the uniform behind. Her office had 2 chairs. Emma sometimes did homework in the corner after school, learning the shape of her mother's real story for the first time. The shadow box hung on Margaret's office wall now, no longer hidden. Beside it, a photograph taken at a Navy reunion, Margaret in her dress blues, Sergeant Major Chen standing beside her, both of them smiling. Her combat boots sat on a shelf in a custom display case Chen had commissioned, the leather preserved under museum glass. They were retired with honor, like the woman who'd worn them. And on the wall, a quote Margaret had written herself, in handwriting that came from muscle memory and military discipline: "Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark." Dr. Sterling lost his medical license permanently within 48 hours. His wife filed for divorce. His country club membership revoked itself without ceremony. 6 months later, he sat at a folding table outside a strip mall in Aurora, selling supplemental insurance policies to people who walked past without making eye contact. The visibility he'd once weaponized became his sentence, the slow, grinding invisibility of irrelevance. Margaret saw him once from a distance, the folding table laden with brochures, and she didn't feel triumph. She felt the kind of recognition that comes from understanding that some people save lives and others exploit the saved, and the universe eventually sorts the difference. Margaret's hands, which had once performed emergency decompression at 4 a.m. in a hospital corridor, now watered a small plant that Emma brought to brighten the office. The nightmares still came sometimes, but she'd started therapy for the first time since 2004, finally ready to speak about the school in Tikrit, about the 12 children, about the cost of carrying memory. Chen visited monthly with his daughter, bringing the kind of gratitude that doesn't need words, just presence, acknowledgement that rescue ripples across decades, and the moment you save someone's life, some part of you becomes responsible for the shape it takes. Margaret was healing in the light now. Not invisible. Not hiding. Finally seen. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the stories of the people the world forgets until the moment they change everything.